Kia ora everyone, and thank you for joining us for our follow-up Q&A session to the post-advice release open Zoom we held on Friday the 11th of June. Ko Charlie Keeling Aho. I'm a senior advisor in the communications and engagement team, and I'll shortly explain how the session will run today. But first, I'm going to ask Phil to lead us in with the karakia.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Philip Warazaho. I'm the team lead for the land and waste. As Charlie said, I'm just going to open with a karakia. Poi poi a te Māori, poi poi a te Wairua, poi poi a te tapu, poi poi a te whenua o Papatūānuku, which translates as nurture the life force, nurture the spirit, nurture the sacredness, and nurture the lands of Mother Earth. Back to you, Charlie.
Kia ora, Phil, thank you. So this session will be purely focused on answering questions that we didn't get to during the Explaining Our Advice session a couple of weeks ago. We've grouped some of them where we noticed common themes and have removed any that aren't really appropriate for us to answer with regards to policy setting, which is the government's role. Our chair, Dr. Rod Carr, and principal analysts and team leads, Alexandra Amos-Setton, Karen Levin and Phil Wiles will be helping to answer your questions. If you'd like to speak to each other or share your thoughts, please feel free to use the chat as always. It's nice to see your conversations and can be a good space to share your thoughts. I also want to let you know we are recording this session, so anyone who couldn't make it and still wanted to hear their question answered will be able to watch it on our website afterwards. So we'll just get started with the first of the questions. Just bear with me one second. So the first subject we're going to cover is energy, industry and buildings. We did have several questions on electricity and just transition and coal during the last session. And we got to most during that last hour, but we'll cover off a couple more now. And we did actually hold some sector-specific sessions over the last couple of weeks, which I'll post links to towards the end of the session if anyone missed those. So Rod, can you please explain why there's not a stronger stand recommended on stopping new and or expanding coal mines in Aotearoa, with it being the biggest threat with regards to climate change through carbon emissions?
So I think there's a couple of things. Our focus had been on providing advice to the government on the direction of policy to support New Zealand's emission budgets, and that is about emissions of activity onshore. So a proportion of New Zealand's coal mining is for export, and that coal is used in steel making, among other things. As yet, there is no widely commercially available alternative for steel making than using the carbon from coal. So that was one part of the reason, is our focus was within meeting our emissions budgets from domestic action. That secondly, even in our own case for coal emissions, there is still some coal emissions out till 2050 because we're assuming that steel making continues in New Zealand. And again, that's a part of our demonstration path. It's not necessarily a prediction that the steel mill will or won't be operating. Obviously, the mill itself is subject to end-of-life challenges, but at the moment, that is the explanation for why we took the position that we did.
Thank you, Rod. And has there been consideration to a level of free electricity to all households to reduce energy poverty? I'll direct that one to you, Rod, as well. And Ali, feel free to add anything after Rod has finished.
Yeah. So we didn't specifically think of about a free allocation to every household. And that is the simple answer. We didn't. But to elaborate a little, the trouble with any universal free allocation is obviously in order to support those who may be least able to afford electricity, you're providing a lot of free electricity to those who would be able and should face the price of electricity. At the moment, the government does have a program in place to support winter electricity bills for lower income groups. And so that assistance is more heavily targeted than some sort of universal free allocation would be.
So, Ali, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, just so I agree with Rod that no, it wasn't specifically considered, and that type of intervention, I would say, is open to the government to consider should they feel appropriate. But the affordability of energy and electricity in particular, in the Commission's view, is crucial to this transition, and in particular for low-income families. One of the problems that we have in New Zealand is that we have a relatively poor housing stock. So it costs a lot to heat your homes because you need a lot of electricity because it gets lost through heat transfer and stuff. So we have made recommendations about targeted intervention that is needed for energy efficiency, and you'll be able to find that in the buildings section of our advice.
Thanks, Ali. And what does the Commission recommend the government does to ensure that the increase in renewable energy infrastructure does not have an adverse impact on nature? Ali, I don't know if you want to have a go at that first, or...
Sure. So New Zealand does have legislation in place that has to be considered when electricity generation companies apply for renewable or any type of generation consents, and that's both the Resource Management Act, but also there's other legislation such as the Wildlife Act. So that process that they need to go through will consider things like the impact on nature. As part of our advice, we do see there needing to be a lot more generation build in order to be able to run an increasing electrified economy. And so we have made recommendations around needing to align some of those considerations to ensure that both we have the amount of renewable electricity that we need, and also that the ecology of the environment is also considered in that process.
Thanks, Ali. We'll move on to transport now, because we had quite a few questions in this area. And again, I can point people to where the recordings of the sector-specific sessions will be towards the end of this session. But Rod, we've got one on EVs for you. On what grounds does the CCC's final report assume first that Kiwis, including poorer Kiwis, will pay more upfront for a new, or at times newish, electric vehicle or hybrid, or secondly, that Kiwis will be open to using public transport more?
So I think the first thing is we're not expecting massive amounts of rapid change, that even in our demonstration path, the reduction in the use of liquid fossil fuels over the next 15 years still sees us using about 2/3 of our current level by 2035. So there's no doubt that a just transition is one that is well signalled and smooth, and leaves options for those who are most able to adjust sooner, and those who are least able to adjust to either be supported in the transition or to adjust later. So there's a bit of media profile that suggests that we might be recommending we ban internal combustion engine cars before EVs and hybrids are affordable. That straw man is exactly that. It's a straw man. It is nowhere in our advice. The reality is that New Zealanders in 2035 will still be travelling nearly half of the kilometres travelled in internal combustion engine cars. That said, as New Zealand replaces its fleet with better, lower emitting vehicles, it is likely the capital cost of the fleet will rise, because it will be a better quality fleet. And that's why, at least in the first part of the transition, we have advised the government it should take up the idea of reducing the capital burden to get through to the lower operating costs of EVs and hybrids. And that is something the government is moving on, and that's to be encouraged. Whether the specific details of the fee-based scheme are the precise calibration that is most efficient is something the government will need to determine through its own consultation and regulatory making processes. But there is no doubt that it is already cheaper to operate an EV or hybrid per kilometre than it is to operate an internal combustion engine car per kilometre. And our own work suggests that whole of life, that includes capital and OPEX, is moving to the point where EVs are comparable to ICEs, and that within 5 years, we'll find that the capital costs align as well.
Thanks, Rod. That was really good. Ali, I've heard that charging an electric vehicle could be as much as 20 houses worth of extra demand on the grid. Is there enough electricity for all the electric vehicles you are recommending? And will the electricity grid be able to cope, or will we have blackouts?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's received a bit of media coverage recently. And the answer depends on how that vehicle is charged. So I think the report that you're referring to is the Vector report, and it assumes that those households install rapid chargers, and they draw a lot more from the grid and therefore would need more support for the grid. Whereas an alternative way of charging vehicles is through a slow charge or a trickle charge, and or with smart charging. So smart charging would look at when the grid times that there's like little other demand on the grid and choose to charge the car at that stage. And so that avoids unnecessary extra load. So in our advice, and in our modelling, we have assumed a well-utilised grid that cars are charged in those off-peak times. And that means that you don't need all of the additional extra capacity for the grid to cope. In saying that, though, as we move to an increasingly electrified system, and that is for both transport and heat, we will need additional generation, renewable generation. New Zealand has an abundance of renewable capacity. And as Rod mentioned before with the EV question, we don't anticipate this, the switch to electrified transport and industry to happen overnight. So that generation build can be planned and happen progressively. But in saying that, it does need to start. Otherwise, it will be challenging to make this transition.
Thanks, Ali. Rod, what will the impact be when the batteries in the EV need to be disposed of? Has this been taken into account, as we are solving a problem now, but we are creating a potentially bigger problem in the future?
I think the challenging question about provenance, where we get inputs from, and end of life are real issues for our society, not limited to EV batteries, but are an awakening of an understanding that there is no such thing as throwing things away. They don't go away, they do go somewhere. I wouldn't be obsessed about EV batteries any more than I would be obsessed about the end of life of oil fields, aluminium smelters, oil refineries. We should be concerned about all of these things. And in my view, there is a bit of a beat-up job on battery electric technology where we should equally be focused on end of life of almost all of our products and infrastructure. That said, there are emerging real opportunities to extend the life of EV batteries and give them a second life thereafter, where the energy drain required to create mobility is less, and therefore these batteries may have a continuing life for at least a period as home or business storage arrays. But you are right, at some point you get to the point where they need substantial re-engineering or they need to be disposed of. Those are matters that the world should consider, and that's why in our advice we say that product stewardship regimes are important and should be applied, particularly to technologies that have high emissions at end of life. So definitely on board, but I wouldn't put the spotlight only on EV batteries when you consider the end of life of fossil fuel coal mines, oil fields, and gas fields. We've got an issue that we need to address systematically across our understanding and use of resources.
Thanks, Rod. I'll throw this out to both Rod or Ali, so whoever wants to take this one. Next generation drop in biofuels could accelerate reduced emissions in heavy vehicles, public transport and aviation. A B5 mandate, as recommended by the Commission, is going to do little to reduce such emissions. Should the Commission not have recommended a higher mandate?
I'll let Ali go for that one.
Cool. I mean, I'd start by saying that I agree that biofuels have a huge potential, particularly in the current vehicle fleet, and particularly for sectors like aviation, which is going to be challenging to decarbonise without some type of liquid fuel alternative. In terms of the B5 mandate specifically, that wasn't actually in our advice. The government has announced a biofuel mandate, although the specific details of it haven't been released in detail. Our advice looks at the challenges of some of the uptakes of biofuels and other low carbon fuels, such as hydrogen. Things like, they cost more than fossil fuels, or additional infrastructure is required in order for them to get off the ground, or even the upfront cost of, for example, a hydrogen or a biofuel powered truck or piece of equipment is a lot more expensive. So our advice really targeted overcoming those particular challenges to increasing biofuels and other low carbon fuels, and saying that one of our recommendations was around suggesting that the government consider some type of mandate or other standard in order to help with the demand of those fuels. But the specific detail, no, that's up for the government.
Thanks, Ali. And just one more for transport. So I'll put this one to you, Rod, since you put the last one on to Ali. Why don't we look at the 15-minute city movement to reduce the need for cars and increase the share of active transport?
We do have some advice for the government about urban form. We certainly accept that building out the density of population at public transport nodes is important. We do think that New Zealand needs to address planning-related matters, but our advice on the direction of policy, rather than the specifics of how would you get it done, leads us to say that, yes, increased density of urban form along public transport routes is an enabler for people to take up more public transport, in the same way that creating cycleways as an enabler for more people to cycle. But at the end of the day, we also need behaviour change. We need people to want to live in these more densely populated urban corridors with access to public transport and infrastructure. So we believe, and we recommend the direction of policy should support the way in which New Zealand builds its urban form in the future. But remember, these things need to be initiated now, but in terms of their impact on emissions, are likely to be in the mid and latter part of the 2030s, 2040s. Not a reason not to get started, but given that our advice to the government is effectively on budgets for the first 3 emissions periods out to 2035, then we were limited in our ability to bank on that having a material impact within that time frame.
Thanks, Rod. I'm now going to move on to some agriculture questions. Again, I can link to where the recordings of the sector sessions will be at the end. But Rod, I'll direct this first one to you. The recent transition to dairy was based on economic drivers. Could we use similar economic drivers to encourage a transition from dairy to agricultural outputs with far less biogenic methane, rather than unproven technological innovation, for example, seaweed and genetics?
So I think the first thing is that our advice doesn't rely on seaweed and genetics. We're very clear in our advice that known technologies and known farm practices in breeding and feeding can achieve the statutory target of a 10% reduction in biogenic methanes by 2030. We also estimate, and it's getting tough because it's out there, that we will be struggling with any certainty to reach the bottom of the statutory target of 24% reduction by 2050. And that what we say is that research should be undertaken to see if there are technologies which could allow for the reduction of biogenic methane from our pastoral ruminant livestock agriculture. So we certainly don't bank on them being achieved. We certainly support exploring whether such technologies could be applied. And of course, in future emissions reduction plans, we're going to either need to take up those new technologies if they are proven, or have alternative ways of achieving with a degree of certainty the emissions reduction targets set for biogenic methane in the latter part of the first half of the century. But Phil, you might have some additional observations.
No, I think that's pretty spot on.
Thanks, Rod. Phil, does the Commission have a view on whether it would be better to price agriculture at the processor or the farm level?
This is a really key question that's being grappled with in other parts of the government work program, which we'll be involved with later. We can see that there are definitely benefits at pricing at a farm level. Essentially, we want to incentivise farmers to uptake some of these things that Rod was talking about, some of these lower emissions practices. And it looks like the best way of doing that is providing the incentive at a farm level rather than at a processor level, which has more of an effect on overall production. But there are some complexities with that. So it means that there will be reporting at a farm level. And we know that farmers already feel like they're doing a lot of paperwork around how they're farming and what they're doing, and are reluctant to undertake more paperwork. So there's a bit of a balance between the complexity which you include at a farm level to drive these on-farm behaviours versus making things simple enough that people can interact with them. Now, next year, we are reviewing the work of He Waka i Ināia, which is a government industry partnership to develop a farm level pricing mechanism, along with policy support tools to go with that. For example, how you measure your on-farm emissions and how you develop plans to reduce those emissions. So we'll get a better opportunity to look at what government and industry are putting together to achieve that, and look at whether they're developing something that is actually applicable and we think will work at a farm level. There's also a question that's just come through in the chat or in the Q&A from Simone. He's asking how we make sure that the incentives to reduce emissions are based on emissions and not profit. And so I think it's the same answer to that question. I think as He Waka i Ināia work through and develop their farm level mechanisms, we'll get an idea. We'll be better able to look at what they're developing and see whether it actually is incentivising the right behaviour based on the right or based on the appropriate measures. Thanks,
Phil. Rod, another one for you. We must consider total global emissions. Given that Aotearoa pastoral farming is the most carbon efficient in the world and we are a net exporter of food products, how are the Commission's aims aligned with the Paris Agreement provision to safeguard food production? In your view, should Aotearoa be a food exporter over the next 20 years?
Well, I think the first thing is the observation New Zealand will be a food exporter over the next decades to come. That was never not on the table. That is the case. We are a food exporter. We will be a food exporter. And so essentially another straw man, which is actually not in the Commission's advice. We will continue to be an agricultural exporter. Secondly, the statutory targets of a 10%, 24 to 47% reduction set by Parliament, not by the Commission. So I think it's important to recognise the role of the Commission is in a split gas world, providing advice to the government on what the step down in emissions budgets should be for biogenic methane to achieve the statutory target, and what would the reduction plan be in order to achieve those budgeted levels of emissions. So that's the third thing is we have to be very careful. While it is true that New Zealand is among the most efficient producers of meat and milk protein from ruminant pastoral livestock agriculture, there may well be alternative lower emission ways of creating proteins than ruminant pastoral agriculture. And the contest in the world will not be about being the best at doing what we do the way we do it. It will be what is the best way of producing proteins to feed 1 billion or 10 billion people? And I think that's where alternative technologies, changing consumer preferences, and offshore regulation are going to play a much bigger part than just whether New Zealand is the most efficient at doing what we do today the way it is done today. I think the final thing I would actually say is that it will be the case that land use changes in New Zealand as it has done for the last 150 years. And the principal driver of that land use change will be economic signals, but also local community-induced regulation of what is socially acceptable in those communities. So, what happens in agriculture is not purely driven by the need for emissions reductions. It will be driven by a whole range of other factors too. But yes, New Zealand will continue to produce and export agricultural products for the decades to come.
Thanks, Rod. Phil, why do you say herds need to be reduced as opposed to methane inhibiting technology being supported?
So this goes back a little bit to the first question in agriculture that Rod answered. But one thing I want to make clear is that we're not recommending that herd sizes need to be reduced. What we are recommending is that there are some efficiencies targeted at greenhouse gas emissions that can be made at a farm level. And these are things that include things like bringing in better genetics onto farms, feed management, and as part of that, we likely will see a reduction in stock numbers. However, we think we can probably maintain about the same overall output. As Rod said before, our analysis shows that if we apply these practices that are currently available, we think we can reach the 10% by 2030 target and the lower end of the 2050 target, that 24% by 2050. However, we also see that we do need new technologies if we want to be more ambitious and have deeper emissions, biogenic methane emissions reductions in agriculture as we get out to 2050 and get more towards that 47% reduction by 2050. So our recommendation is that we do step back and look at take a more strategic view about what technologies we think we might need and give ourselves a good chance of realising some of those technologies that we can then apply on farm into the future.
Thanks, Phil. And we've got one on forestry here, which I'll direct to you, Rod. The advice focuses on establishing native forest on marginal erodible hill country for carbon sequestration and co-benefits. But what about restoration of lowland forests in our rural working lands? This can also deliver considerable co-benefits, particularly for biodiversity, water quality, and climate resilience, for example, flood protection.
Yes, we agree. So that's the short answer. Yes, we agree. It is true that we have a very ambitious expectation that New Zealand will be able to develop 25,000 hectares a year of permanent additional sequestration in what we call natives, but think of them as longer, slower growing lived trees, that we will be able to step up and sustain an additional 25,000 hectares a year of protected and developed natives, and that we'll get that done by 2025 and every year thereafter. So absolutely, this is about not only those more marginal and remoter, but also some of those lower, more accessible gullies and backdrops in different farm settings. So this is not an either or conversation. This is an and conversation.
Thanks, Rod. Now I'm just going to move on to a number of questions on other topics. So Karen, I'll direct the first one to you. There's a huge reliance on scenarios and models for the advice. However, we live in a complex adaptive environment, which means that models will consistently underestimate uncertainty and render scenario bounds essentially meaningless over long time frames. Isn't there a danger that we rely too much on models?
Kia ora koutou. That's correct that we don't know exactly how the future will play out. So some technologies might come on faster than we predict, and then other technologies might not. And so it's not possible for any form of modelling to precisely predict the future. But that's not a reason not to use models. It's about how we use models and what we use them for. And so in our advice, we've used models to give us a sense of the scale of the transformation that's possible, and also to help us understand how various elements of the system interact. So for example, how much more renewable electricity will we need if we're going to electrify more transport and process heat? So rather than focusing on the exact route for reducing emissions, we've focused on how much we can reduce emissions in light of uncertainty. And in recommending our emissions budgets, we've tested that there are multiple different ways that we could meet them in light of that uncertainty. So coming back to the question of whether there's a danger that we rely too much on models, I'd say it's really about how we use those models. In my mind, the far greater danger is using uncertainty as a reason for delay. And that comes back to the title of our report, Ināia, tonu. The time is now.
Thanks, Karen. So Rod, the next one I'll pass over to you, but why are methane targets so low when we know we only have a couple of decades to dramatically reduce emissions, and that these short-lived gases are so much more potent than other greenhouse gases?
Well, I think it comes back to that question. The split gas approach and the setting of the targets was by our elected representatives. It was a social political choice informed by the evidence. And the evidence is that we need to reduce, but not to zero, biogenic methane emissions. That the work that the Minister asked us to do on saying what does the latter part of the century look like says that in a steady state where we're not contributing to global warming, then we need to get this reduction in biogenic methane emissions to be more in the order of 49 to 60%. So if we are well on track to get to the 47% end of the range by 2050, that would be consistent with heading to a steady state. So that's one line of argument, is the targets have been set by Parliament, not by the Commission. Secondly, half of the world's methane emissions are the fugitive byproducts of the fossil fuel industry, so from coal mining, from oil and gas extraction. And that's got to be low-hanging fruit, to the sense that that is a waste byproduct of a sector we need to decarbonise. And therefore, given that the biogenic methane is a product of food production, and therefore is not, in that sense, a purely waste product, there is good reason to expect that you would want to focus your methane reduction on the byproduct from the fossil fuel use and generation sector. And that doesn't mean you don't get round to doing the reductions that you need to do in agriculture, but certainly they are harder to do and therefore likely to be more expensive in terms of lost output and production than some of the other ways in which methane reduction needs to occur.
Thanks, Rod. Karen, what is the contingency plan if the carbon sequestration part of our net emissions plan is not working, i.e. if we fail to prove that we are removing CO2 at the rate required to balance remaining emissions?
Yes, so there's, I guess, two parts to that question. One is about sequestering carbon in forestry, and the other is about the contingency planning. So just to start out with, it's worth emphasising that we're recommending more of a focus on reducing gross emissions. So we still need to build a long-term carbon sink to offset residual emissions in some sectors, and that's because we know achieving complete decarbonisation in some sectors is going to be really challenging. But what we're recommending is less new exotic forests than what's projected to occur if we were to continue under business as usual with the policy settings that we currently have in place. And instead focusing more on native forests, which Rod mentioned earlier, that they grow slower, and so they can help to offset emissions out to 2050 and beyond 2050. Relying too heavily on forestry, and particularly on exotics, it could help us to meet our net zero 2050 target, but it would make maintaining net zero beyond 2050 more challenging, and that would delay action on reducing gross emissions, and it would push the burden for reducing emissions onto future generations. In terms of the contingency planning side of things, a key thing that we've shown in our advice is that emissions budgets could be met in a number of different ways. And so it's not just if afforestation doesn't occur as we might predict, but also we can't foresee how quickly other technologies might roll out, as I mentioned earlier. So there are a few other contingencies that are also built in to the mechanisms. So one is that we'll be monitoring progress each year. So if things aren't going quite as we expect, particularly in the policy space, we can be bringing that to people's attention. One is that we can look at revising future emissions budgets if there's a significant change and it's warranted. One is that if we don't meet an emissions budget, we can borrow a small amount from the next emissions budget. And the other is offshore mitigation. So while the Climate Change Response Act doesn't allow us to plan to use offshore mitigation, we can use it if there is something that happens that we weren't able to foresee.
I would also add that all other things being equal, if we fail to achieve the levels of sequestration and everything else stays the same, then it is likely that the price of an NZU under the emissions trading scheme will be higher than it would be on our demonstration path, and that would itself incentivise further either afforestation or gross emissions reduction.
Thanks, Rod and Karen. Rod, can you comment on the ETS price? At current pricing, there is little incentive to shift behaviour. How can we ensure the ETS price reflects to the true social cost of carbon?
I don't think the ETS price will ever reflect the true social cost of carbon. The fact is, at the moment, it only covers half of our emissions. The incentive at the moment, given the ETS settings, is essentially to pay the price, pollute and plant a tree. And the Commission knows that that is not the socially optimal outcome that we need. So the Commission's advice is that work needs to be done to strengthen the ETS in a regulatory sense, but also to ensure that the ETS doesn't have unintended consequences and is aligned to reducing gross emissions, because in the end, that is the most sustainable way in which we decarbonise the economy. So the ETS can never represent all of the costs and benefits of decarbonising our economy. It can create a price signal that will change the behaviours of investors, of producers and consumers, but it cannot do all the work that needs to be done. In part, we already see that the ETS is having an influence on some choices by some investors who are now rolling out more renewable energy in the form of geothermal fields, wind farms and solar arrays. And we're likely to see the ETS having some impact on the long-term estimated marginal cost of energy generation and use. So that too will begin to change behaviours. But the ETS will never capture all of the health benefits of living in a cleaner and greener economy. The ETS will never capture all of the risk reduction from increased biodiversity or the costs and risks of reduced biodiversity. So we cannot expect the ETS to do all things that need to be done.
Thanks, Rod. I've got another couple for you. So the first one, what is included in offshore mitigations and how do we promote this?
Oh, extremely good question. So offshore mitigation is the phrase that is used to describe a circumstance in which one sovereign state, one nation state, buys permanent and additional emissions reductions from another nation state, where those emissions reductions are over and above what that nation has committed to under the Paris Agreement. So in a way, that's the easiest thing in the whole construct, is to describe what it is in theory. In practice, there is no marketplace to go to buy emissions reductions from foreign nation states. In reality, there is a series of bilateral agreements emerging. For example, Switzerland has agreed 4 framework agreements with other nation states where Switzerland will pay for permanent and additional emissions reduction in those countries. But there is no marketplace as such. The price of that emissions reduction is unknown and at this point unknowable. Certainly, we don't know what emissions reduction through offshore mitigation will cost us in 2030. So we know neither the volume, nor the price, nor the counterparties to these transactions. The Paris Agreement sets an architecture for conversations that might create opportunities, both for bilateral agreements, but also for a multilateral trade and NZU equivalence. But the last attempt to have a global marketplace for emissions failed under the Kyoto Agreement, and that itself has led to some loss of confidence about the likelihood that such a market will be up and running within the next decade. But others may have some observations about offshore mitigation as well.
Does anyone have anything else to add, or shall I just move on to the next question? Okay, thanks, Rod. Despite many requests, the report does not recommend strongly the use of deliberative democracy to inform government on the wisdom of the diversity or of ordinary people and what we see as important for our whole community and its future. These processes are well researched and substantiated globally, except in Aotearoa. Why has the Commission only mentioned this in the report in passing?
Well, we do actually have a recommendation that a public forum be created. So I think it's not the case that we mention it only in passing. There is a recommendation. Obviously, in a democracy, it is for Parliament to decide what types of fora should be established, how they should be resourced, who should be appointed to them or elected to them, and what their part would be. And we didn't feel it was the Commission's mandate to go more than the direction of policy. So we endorse such an opportunity without prescribing how it should be met.
Thanks, Rod. And now, just because we've got a bit of time, I'm going to ask a couple that we've had through the Q&A today as well. So, Ali, you might be able to answer this one. On the topic of EV feebates, why weren't hybrids included as a transition incentive?
Cool. So in this question, I presume you're referring to the government's feebate scheme that they have recently released, which they have called the Clean Car Discount. And they do include hybrids in that. So the cars that get the most money rebated, if you like, are pure electric vehicles. But then there is a sliding scale that includes both plug-in hybrids and what we would call conventional hybrids. So they have a small electric motor, but you can't plug them into your house or a charger. And also smaller, more efficient vehicles. So there's a range of vehicles that they do get an incentive on, and conversely, less efficient vehicles and particularly heavier vehicles, they will have to pay a fee. So hence it is called the feebate scheme.
Thanks, Ali. We've had a couple through on solar. So I'm just going to try and sort of merge those a little bit. Rod, I wonder if you could try and answer these, but surely home-based solar is a no-brainer as it will reduce or delay the need to upgrade the grid, provide inexpensive home power and potentially support overnight powering of EV cars. What is the recommendation of the Commission here? And then I'll ask a follow-up question after that.
So we don't have a specific recommendation on home solar. My understanding is that only about 35% of New Zealand residential properties would be suitable for rooftop solar. And that's partly because of the way in which houses are built, the way they face, and various other regulatory constraints of impacts on neighbours or heritage street fronts and blah, 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 and on it goes. So about a third of houses might have the opportunity. Secondly, you do have this challenge where the beneficiary of rooftop solar is the occupant of the house. That occupant may be a tenant. So you've got the natural misalignment of agency principles between the owner of the house and the occupier of the house may not be the same. So rooftop solar subsidies are typically captured by owner-occupiers, not necessarily renters. So there are some distributional implications of that as well. And then finally, as a personal statement, we have indeed put 12 kilowatts of rooftop solar on our house. We do, in fact, get the benefit of that. It is reasonably intermittent, so you still need grid connection. And even with the maximum solar array on our Christchurch house, it displaces about a half of our electricity use. But certainly there will be circumstances where rooftop solar is rewarded by the homeowner occupier, and therefore a subsidy would not be required. So again, it comes back to, if you're going to make public funds available, where do you target the benefit, who gets that benefit? In a way, you don't want to incentivize behavior that people would, for their own reasons, undertake anyway. You want to use the subsidy to incentivize those who might not otherwise have taken up that option, rather than just to make it cheaper for those who would.
Thanks, Rod. And a follow-up question here as well, just related to that while we're on the topic. Why does the Commission not recommend changes to the building code to mandate solar panels on every new house and removal of the solar tax by lines companies?
Yeah, so the first part of that question is answered by the depends how you want to target the benefit and who's going to get the uplift. The so-called solar tax, I've never heard it quite called that way, but both for load management reasons and reasons of their own, which I don't always understand, different lines companies have different both tariffs, which they pay homeowners who deliver power to the grid, and in fact, in some cases, quantitative limits on how much power they will take and pay for. And that in part is a technical issue about grid management, and in part, I imagine it's a pricing issue. And if you end up providing your solar power at a time of day when that lines company doesn't necessarily need it, then not surprisingly, they don't particularly want it. And at the time of day when they may face the greatest demand, they may discover that there is limited or no solar delivery. So complicated issue, but different around New Zealand if you're dealing with different lines companies, it turns out, or different retailers, in fact, who are often the price points for determining what consumers are able to get for electricity they generate.
Thanks, Rod. And I've got one more here for you, Ali. What would process heat be generated? Why would process heat, be generated by electricity and not biomass? Electricity is by far the most expensive way of generating process heat.
Yeah, so we see both. We're starting to see some heat switch over to biomass now. At the moment, there's been companies make announcements that they're doing that. In terms of what's in our advice and our demonstration path, we see both. So whether biomass or electricity makes sense to generate process heat can depend on where in the country that boiler is. So if there is a forestry source and a biomass source close by, then it might make sense for that particular part to be powered by biomass. But if there is no forestry source in the region and transporting it can be expensive, then it might make more sense for that boiler to be powered by electricity. But you are right that at the moment, electricity is more expensive, particularly than coal. And in terms of, electricity for process heat, also it could be transmission and connection upgrades as well, which all adds to the cost. But our advice does see that both will occur.
Thanks, Ali. I'll just double check if we have any final questions. Rod, I'm not sure if this is one you might be able to answer. To help fill the gap left by rapidly declining natural gas resources, has the Commission considered that some of the wood chip and logs currently leaving Aotearoa could be used as a boiler fuel by industrial heat users? Even if paying current high log prices, that steam would cost much less than steam from electric boilers.
Yeah, so in fact, in our demonstration path, there is a point at which we assume that the diversion of pine logs for biomass may be economic in the future. It clearly depends on the interaction between log export prices, onshore biomass sources and resources, and the alternative of electricity or lingering fossil fuel gas in the network. So that interplay is one the Commission doesn't try and regulate, but in our price path, once you get to emissions prices in the ETS of north of $140 a tonne, there is a point at which using pulp logs for biomass will make economic sense, depending on what happens to the log price. It is interesting that my understanding is that China has had a moratorium on logging its own forests for several decades, and that moratorium expires around 2035. So the way in which New Zealand logs are used in China, which is not all of our export logs, but it is certainly a proportion of them, is they're often used for boxing for concrete form work. So they're never treated and they're never left in the built environment. And so it will be interesting to see going forward what the demand and international price is for New Zealand pulp logs. But it may well be the case that onshore use as a biomass source does make economic sense in the 2030s.
Thanks, Rod. We've just got one more question. We've got time for one more question before we close. So in a previous webinar, it was discussed that linking the New Zealand ETS with other jurisdictions is being investigated to assist New Zealand in meeting its targets. Can you elaborate, please? What jurisdictions are being investigated and what is the time frame?
Look, I think the only way I can square the circle on that is to say, as I said earlier, talking about the ETS, that under the Paris Agreement, bilateral agreements are possible, subject to certain transparency and monitoring terms, that there is the construct that there could be a global market, but the work to establish that is not necessarily one that New Zealand is leading. It is work that needs to be done by the international community. So the Climate Change Commission is not undertaking a work screen at this stage. Much of that is diplomatic matters in the hands of our Ministry for Foreign Affairs and Trade.
Thank you, Rod. So that's all we've really got time for now anyway, but thank you to everyone who asked a question in the previous webinar and who have asked some questions live today as well. And thanks to Ali, Karen, Phil and Rod for answering the questions. We will be making the recording available on our website, as I mentioned earlier. So just to close us off, I'm going to hand over to Phil for the karakia.
Thank you, Charlie. And thanks for the great questions, interactions. We've really appreciated that throughout our process. We challenged on some of our thinking and to make sure that it's robust. So thank you. Do keep us to account. E te atua manakitia mai mātou e hoki nei ki o mātou kāinga. Amene. Bless us all as we return to our homes. Ka kite anō.
Kia ora, everybody.
Kia ora, everyone.